The dark truth about human nature hidden inside crime and punishment, American Psycho and Lord of the Flies, what the most disturbing books on evil quietly reveal about ordinary people. Most people imagine evil as something dramatic, a monster, a psychopath, a dictator, a serial killer standing far outside ordinary life. But the most disturbing lesson, hidden inside the greatest psychological novels, is the opposite one. Evil often begins with ordinary reasoning. It starts with justification, with ego, with resentment, with status anxiety, with humiliation, with boredom, with the quiet belief that the rules should not fully apply to you. That is what makes it dangerous. The human mind is extraordinarily good at explaining its own darkness back to itself in morally acceptable language. People rarely experience themselves as villains. They experience themselves as misunderstood, exceptional, pressured, trapped, entitled, intelligent, wounded, superior, ignored, or necessary. The real horror is not that evil exists. The real horror is how psychologically normal parts of it can feel while it is happening. The deepest psychological fiction understands this uncomfortable truth better than most academic theories ever will. Some novels do not merely describe crime or violence. They dissect the machinery underneath it. They expose the inner logic people use to cross moral lines while still seeing themselves as rational human beings. And once you see that pattern clearly, you start noticing it everywhere. In politics, corporations, relationships, online culture, financial fraud, mob behavior, ideological extremism, social cruelty, and even ordinary personal decisions. The psychology of evil is not simply about sadism. It is about self-justification, colliding with human weakness. Books synthesized. Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Evil begins with permission. One of the strongest shared lessons across these works is that human beings do not suddenly become monstrous. They gradually grant themselves permission. That permission can come from ideology, status, desperation, conformity, resentment, nihilism, group pressure, social collapse, or personal vanity. But psychologically, the mechanism is remarkably similar. The individual slowly creates a moral exception for themselves. One protagonist convinces himself that extraordinary people should exist outside conventional morality. Another hides behind wealth, image, consumer culture, and emotional emptiness. Another group descends into savagery once the structures of civilization weaken. Different environments, different personalities, different forms of violence, but the same psychological movement. The line between civilized behavior and barbarism is far thinner than modern societies like to admit. This is partly because morality is less stable than people imagine. Most individuals believe they possess fixed values. In reality, human morality is heavily influenced by environment, incentives, identity, fear, social pressure, and emotional state. Remove enough stability, and behavior changes faster than people expect. That is why prosperous societies often become overconfident about civilization. Comfort creates the illusion that order is natural. It is not natural, it is maintained. History repeatedly demonstrates this. Economic collapse, war, humiliation, political instability, tribal division, and institutional breakdown can transform ordinary populations with terrifying speed. The frightening part is not that a few people become violent. The frightening part is how quickly cruelty becomes socially acceptable once enough people psychologically normalize it. The novels approach this from different angles, but together they form a larger argument. Evil is often less about monsters appearing and more about restraint disappearing. Intelligence does not protect people from moral collapse. One of the most important psychological insights across these works is that intelligence is not moral protection. In some cases, it makes the situation worse. Highly intelligent people are often better at rationalization. They can construct elegant arguments for terrible behavior. They can intellectualize cruelty. They can detach themselves emotionally from consequences. They can redefine selfishness as superiority. This appears repeatedly in psychological history. Some of the worst atrocities ever committed were carried out not by irrational chaos alone, but by educated systems filled with administrators, planners, lawyers, strategists, and intellectuals capable of explaining why normal moral rules no longer applied. The danger is not stupidity. The danger is intelligence detached from conscience. One of the recurring themes within Dostoevsky's work is the psychological destruction that follows when somebody attempts to elevate themselves above ordinary morality. Raskolnikov convinces himself that superior individuals possess the right to transgress ethical rules for supposedly greater purposes, but the deeper punishment is psychological collapse itself. That idea remains profoundly modern. Many destructive individuals genuinely believe they are exceptions. Some think they are smarter than the rules. Others think they are more important than the people harmed by their behavior. Some convince themselves that morality is merely social theater for weaker people. But human psychology rarely tolerates complete moral fragmentation cleanly. Even when guilt is suppressed, it often reappears indirectly through paranoia, emotional numbness, aggression, compulsive behavior, addiction, or escalating detachment from reality. The mind can rationalize almost anything. What it struggles to escape are the consequences of becoming disconnected from its own humanity. The Patrick Bateman illusion. Modern evil often looks polished. That is one of the most unsettling lessons in the contemporary psychological landscape. People still instinctively associate danger with visibly unstable individuals, but many destructive personalities function extremely well socially. They understand image. They understand performance. They understand status signaling. They know how to imitate normality. That makes them harder to identify. The world of extreme corporate narcissism portrayed in Ellis's novel feels exaggerated on the surface. Yet, psychologically, it captures something disturbingly real about modern identity culture. Consumerism, status obsession, superficial networking, performative success, and emotional emptiness can create people who appear highly functional externally, while internally becoming detached, hollow, and morally numb. This matters because societies increasingly reward surface performance. Image management is now a major life skill. Social media intensified this dramatically. People curate identities professionally, romantically, politically, and socially. Validation becomes externalized. The self becomes performative. Authenticity weakens. Human beings slowly start treating themselves like brands. That creates psychological fragmentation. Once identity becomes performance, empathy can start collapsing underneath it. Other people become tools, audiences, obstacles, or symbols rather than fully human individuals. The frightening thing about Bateman is not simply the violence, it is the emptiness. He exists inside a culture obsessed with appearance, wealth, prestige, and social comparison. Nobody truly knows anybody else. Conversations are hollow. Morality becomes aesthetic rather than ethical. The external world appears successful while internally everything feels spiritually dead. That emotional deadness matters enormously. Many forms of cruelty emerge not from intense hatred, but from emotional disconnection. The inability to emotionally experience other people as fully real human beings lowers psychological resistance to exploitation and harm. Civilization depends heavily on emotional recognition. When people stop seeing others as human beings, moral collapse accelerates quickly. Civilization is a psychological agreement. One of the deepest ideas hidden across these works is that civilization itself is partly psychological theater. Not fake theater, necessary theater. Human societies survive because enough people collectively agree to obey rules, restrain impulses, trust systems, and punish violations consistently. That agreement creates predictability. Predictability creates stability. Stability allows civilization to function. But beneath that structure, human beings remain biologically ancient creatures carrying aggression, tribal instincts, fear responses, dominance hierarchies, sexual competition, insecurity, resentment, and capacity for violence. Modern life often disguises this reality rather than eliminating it. Golding's novel remains so powerful because it strips away institutional structure and observes what emerges underneath. Once authority weakens, tribalism strengthens, fear escalates, group psychology changes, violence becomes easier. Individuals start behaving differently once accountability disappears. Importantly, the boys do not become evil overnight. The transformation is gradual. Games become rituals. Rituals become tribal identity. Tribal identity becomes violence. That psychological sequence appears repeatedly throughout history. Humans are extraordinarily influenced by group dynamics. People who would never act violently alone may participate in cruelty collectively if social permission exists. Mob psychology demonstrates this constantly. Crowds reduce personal responsibility. Group identity overrides individual conscience. Emotional intensity rises. Nuance collapses. Tribal narratives simplify morality into us versus them frameworks. Once that happens, almost any behavior can become psychologically justifiable. This is why ideological extremism becomes so dangerous. Whether political, religious, cultural, or social, extreme group identity can psychologically override ordinary moral restraint. People stop evaluating actions independently. Instead, morality becomes determined by loyalty to the group. At that point, evil rarely feels evil internally. It feels righteous. Moral fracture framework. The strongest combined lesson across these works can be reduced into what might be called the moral fracture framework. Human beings rarely collapse morally through one dramatic decision. They fracture progressively through 5 stages. 1. Alienation. The individual begins feeling psychologically separated from ordinary people. This can emerge through superiority, humiliation, resentment, status obsession, ideological extremism, loneliness, or emotional detachment. 2. Rationalization. The person develops intellectual explanations for behavior that would normally feel wrong. They redefine morality to suit emotional desire. 3. Dehumanization. Other people stop feeling fully real. They become symbols, obstacles, categories, tools, or abstractions. 4. Permission. The individual psychologically grants themselves exceptions to moral rules. The internal barrier weakens. 5. Escalation. Once the first line is crossed successfully, future violations become easier. Behavior normalizes itself internally. This framework applies far beyond fictional murderers. It appears in abusive relationships, corrupt corporations, extremist politics, online mob behavior, organized crime, financial fraud, bullying cultures, cults, warfare, and ordinary personal betrayals. The scale changes. The psychology often does not. Why guilt matters more than punishment. Modern culture often misunderstands guilt. People increasingly view guilt as weakness, social conditioning, or emotional inconvenience. But psychologically healthy guilt performs an essential function. It reconnects behavior to conscience. Without guilt, human beings become dangerous. Dostoevsky understood this profoundly. The true punishment is not prison. The true punishment is fragmentation of the self. When individuals violate their own moral structure deeply enough, they often begin psychologically deteriorating, even if they avoid legal consequences. Anxiety, paranoia, emotional instability, compulsive behavior, emotional numbness, dissociation, aggression, and self-destruction frequently follow. This does not happen because morality is merely social programming. It happens because humans appear psychologically built for moral coherence. People need to perceive themselves as meaningfully human. Severe moral contradiction destabilizes identity itself. That is why confession remains psychologically powerful across cultures. Speaking truth restores internal alignment. Denial requires constant mental maintenance. Lies fracture identity because the mind must continuously defend incompatible realities. The modern world sometimes romanticizes emotional numbness as strength. It is often psychological damage. What most people misunderstand about evil. Most people think evil is primarily about hatred. Often it is not. Many atrocities emerge through indifference, conformity, tribal loyalty, ambition, insecurity, fear, ego, or self-preservation. Some individuals become cruel because they enjoy power. Others become cruel because they stop emotionally processing consequences. Some become cruel because everyone around them normalizes it. Some become cruel because resentment slowly corrodes empathy. Evil is often frighteningly mundane. That insight became famous through discussions surrounding totalitarian bureaucracy in the 20th century. History showed repeatedly that ordinary individuals could participate in horrific systems while psychologically perceiving themselves as normal people performing practical roles. This remains deeply relevant. Modern societies often assume technological progress automatically creates moral progress. There is very little evidence for this assumption. Technology amplifies human capability. It does not automatically improve human character. In fact, modern systems sometimes intensify psychological risks. Social media amplifies tribalism. Consumer culture amplifies narcissism. Algorithmic environments reward outrage. Political polarization rewards dehumanization. Digital anonymity weakens accountability. Constant comparison intensifies insecurity and resentment. Many people are psychologically overstimulated, emotionally disconnected, socially fragmented, and existentially adrift. That creates fertile ground for moral deterioration. Not necessarily spectacular evil, but quieter forms. Cruelty, exploitation, manipulation, emotional numbness, public humiliation culture, dehumanizing rhetoric, tribal hatred, social sadism disguised as entertainment. Civilization weakens slowly before it breaks dramatically. The desire to feel superior. One of the strongest recurring themes across these works is superiority. Human beings desperately want significance. That desire itself is not inherently bad. Ambition, achievement, excellence, mastery, and status striving helped build civilization. The danger emerges when significance becomes psychologically tied to domination, exemption, or contempt. The moment somebody believes ordinary rules should not apply to them, moral danger increases dramatically. This appears constantly throughout history. Political leaders who view themselves as historically necessary, corporate executives who justify exploitation through profit, violent ideologues who see themselves as morally enlightened, narcissists who believe emotional rules apply only to weaker people. The pattern repeats endlessly. Psychologically, superiority can become intoxicating because it temporarily protects people from feelings of insecurity, insignificance, shame, or weakness. But maintaining superiority often requires reducing other people psychologically. Contempt becomes addictive. That is why humiliation plays such a powerful role in violence and abuse. Some individuals temporarily regulate their own insecurity by degrading others. The terrifying part is how ordinary this mechanism can become socially. Entire systems sometimes organize themselves around it. The thin line between order and chaos. Perhaps the darkest shared lesson across these books is that civilization is not guaranteed. Human beings prefer believing social order is permanent because the alternative feels psychologically disturbing. But history repeatedly demonstrates that stable societies can deteriorate faster than populations expect. Economic collapse, political instability, institutional distrust, mass fear, humiliation, propaganda, tribal fragmentation, and elite failure can radically alter social behavior within surprisingly short periods. This does not mean humanity is doomed, but it does mean morality requires maintenance. Strong societies do not survive purely through laws. They survive through cultural expectations, moral education, emotional stability, functioning institutions, accountability, social trust, and enough people voluntarily restraining destructive impulses. Once enough people stop believing in shared moral rules, systems weaken rapidly. That is why cynicism can become dangerous culturally. A society that no longer believes truth matters, trust matters, or morality matters becomes psychologically unstable. Eventually, force replaces trust, and force is always more brutal. The most important lesson of all. The greatest psychological novels do not merely ask why evil exists. They ask what prevents it. That is the more important question, because once you understand how ordinary human beings justify darkness, you stop imagining morality as automatic. You realize character is built through habits, restraint, honesty, emotional awareness, accountability, and conscious resistance to self-deception. Most people are capable of both kindness and cruelty depending on environment, incentives, pressure, fear, identity, and emotional state. That should produce humility, not arrogance. The deepest warning hidden inside these works is not that evil belongs to monsters somewhere far away. It is that human beings possess an extraordinary ability to rationalize behavior once ego, fear, tribalism, status, resentment, or ideology begin overriding conscience. Civilization survives when enough individuals resist that process. The line between order and chaos does not run between different species of people. It runs through every human mind, and that may be the most uncomfortable psychological truth literature ever discovered.